In this position, playing rook to c8 to start attacking the pawn and taking the undefended pawns, well, they're all undefended, will be naive, because what black will do is simply move the king away, and then this pawn will be too close to the edge, and we're going to have to sacrifice the rook. So king e3 is the best move now, because we need to get our king close to the pawns. One principle in the endgame is that you don't want to waste your time attacking something that can't go forward. So we don't really have any rush of taking this pawn in c5, because that pawn is not going anywhere. So let's just make useful moves, like king getting closer to the last rank, to the first rank would be ideal, so that the pawns can get to the other side. Best move by black now is king to c1, keeping an eye on all these squares, making sure that the white king doesn't get any close. So what's the move now? King e2. The reason is we need this tempo move. We weren't going anywhere, like none of these squares like d3, d4 were accessible. So after king e2 now, it's the black to move again. And a king can't hang around king c2 because of rook to b8, which stops the king from going to the b file, and also stops the king from going to the d file because of the white king. The king is now forced to go down, and now the rook will simply stay on the b file, attacking the pawns. And the fact that we have a well-placed king allows us to not worry about the opponent's pawn promoting. So for example, let's say black king goes back to c2. Okay, rook b5. King goes back to c1, and we can take the pawn. And now our king is close enough. Black cannot push the pawn in c2 because simply we can take, and then black will have to move the king on the b file. But then we have the king going to d2, and we have two attackers. And in this position, if instead of king c2 black plays c2, we just waste the tempo and go to b6 with the rook. Now black can't move the king anywhere. He has to push a pawn. And now rook to b3 is the crucial move. We are forcing the black player to push a pawn. He can't move the king. He must move this pawn to c4. And now inevitably we're going to take the pawn in c3, and the king is getting close to c2, to d2, and then there's going to be double attack on c1. In this position, again, we need to follow the principle that if a pawn or a piece is not going anywhere, then you don't need to rush to attack it, because that will give your opponent extra tempo. Rook e3 will be a mistake to go and attack the pawn, or simply the square c3, because c2 and then rook c3, then black is able to go to e5, careless of the check, because let's say you check, but then the king is getting closer. And now the opponent, our king is not going to be able to reach any of the squares next to the black king, and he will be able to push the pawn. Well, if you take the pawn in c7, and black will play king to d3, and you will force the white player to sacrifice, because you will never be able to take a pawn that just promotes with a rook if your king is not close enough. The rook on its own cannot do this, especially if the black king is closer to the pawn. So to his own pawn. So rook c7 doesn't work. If you want to play this pawn because it's the closest to the edge, it doesn't make a difference, because c5 now comes. And the simple fact that you cannot get the king to any of these squares on the e file means that you will not be able to get the king close enough to the promotion square, which is c1. That means you're going to have to sacrifice the rook. Nothing will stop black from playing these kind of moves. c4, king d3, c3, and so on. So back at the original position, the best move now is rook to e2. Better than rook e3, because rook e3 allows black to play c2, winning a tempo on the rook. So the rook will have to do something about it, go to c3, and that allows the black king, to go to e5. The difference is that now that we play rook e2 instead, c2 cannot happen because it will be taken straight away. So we're winning a crucial tempo. So let's say c2, then we can take, and now there's a difference. The king can play e5, but the difference from before is that now we can take this pawn with check, and we're also making a fork. We're attacking the pawn in c7, so winning that extra tempo was crucial. King going to c7, d6 to protect the pawn, is met by rook going to h5, cutting the opponent king's possibility to go down. And this pawn is not going anywhere. So now we are going to have all the time we want to remaneuver our king, and to eventually reach, depending on how black plays, this square c1. the pawn cannot push forward because we're just going to ignore it. We're just going to leave it like that. If the pawn keeps going and going, it's going to take us 2 moves to go and safeguard the last square. So now we're in the 5th rank. So it's going to take us 1, and then the king goes down, and then 2, and then we're going to make it in time to take the pawn. Back at the original position, rook to e2 is the best move. What happens if black wants to try and get the king closer? So king f5. This is met by king g7. These pawns aren't really strong after all, so they cannot defend each other, so the rook just doesn't have to worry. We don't have any rush. So after the best move c4, king f7. Then after c6, king e7. If black plays king to f4, trying to get king closer to the rook, we're just going to ignore it. Of course, we're going to go with the king. The idea to reach the square of promotion. King d6, king f3, and now best move by white is rook to e1 to block the king from going to the e file. It's important that rook to c2 is not played because the king is close enough to go to the defense of the c4 pawn. Rook e1 is the best move. And if the king chases after the rook, then rook e4 wins because the king is blocked by going to the e file and nothing stops us from taking these pawns. The king is too far. And if black plays c2 instead of king f2, he's trying to trick us because we cannot play rook c1 now. Again, the king is close enough to go in the defense of one of the pawns, which is going to be enough for black to force us to sacrifice the rook. So now the best move is king to c5. We don't even bother taking this pawn. Of course, that would be a waste of tempo. It would be crucial. We have to get as soon as possible into the c1 square. And then these pawns, none of them is going anywhere. So after king f2, again attacking the rook now can go to c1. And our king is close enough to the c4 pawn, which means that we are able to take it. And this king is not going to be able to make it in time because like king e2, we can take the pawn with check. And our king is close to c4, so we're going to be able to take all the pawns. So for the last time, with the original position, rook e2, and let's try c4 instead of king f5. Now white plays rook e4. Best move by black is c5. The idea of the black player is that as soon as we take the pawn, black will be able to come close, like e5, d4, and then stay next to the pawn. Of course, we have to move the king. It's crucial that we get the king involved. The idea here will be king h5, and then the idea here will be king h5, g4, f3, e2, d1, right? But would be amazing if we could make these moves. King f5 attacking the rook, and now we can take the pawn. The reason is that after king e5, we're going to be able to go to g5 with the king, and we are creating an opposition. So after king to d5 attacking the rook and getting close to the protection of this c5 pawn, the rook can take in c3, and now king d4 is not a problem simply because we can play rook to c1, and after c4, king to f4. Again, we are creating an opposition, which means we are blocking the king from the possibility to go to any of the squares of the e file. King d3 is met by king f3, keeping the opposition, and now king cannot play to d2 because the pawn is going to be dropping, and also the white king is planning to go to e2. So after c3, only move. Now that we have the opposition, we can go into the typical pattern of rook check and the king blocking all of these squares, and the king is now forced to go on the same rank of his own pawns. King c2 will be met by king e2 and white wins. Why? Well, king moving will be met by king up, and now we have an attacker on c2 and soon we'll have another one. The rook wants to go to c1, so if the king moves away, rook c1 wins, and if the pawn goes down, then the rook can pin the pawn, and we have two attackers. Same position here. After the check, we went to c2. What happens if the king goes to c4? Then we're just getting closer, stopping the opponent king from going to the e file, and the king moves. We have similar position. If the pawn pushes, then we can just attack it. We have two attackers, and if the king moves, we're just gonna waste the tempo like this. If king goes back, we can go and attack the pawn with two attackers, and if the pawn goes forward, we can pin it.